the spotlight panels for the 1999 Combined Central States Southern Communication Conference, and thank you for coming. This panel was sort of commissioned in a way, and when you try to plan large-scale, rather unorthodox things, there are sometimes problems. So what you're getting here is not exactly what you were promised in your program, but I think that we maintain the substance. When I was first asked to try to help organize something in part to bring increased visibility to public address and rhetorical criticism at the Central Convention at least, I had a sort of flow-zig field moment where I imagined us doing this in the courtroom where the decision was originally argued, and with oral interpretation of various significant parts of the text in a big 2-hour time slot. And we worked hard to get those things, and I do want to acknowledge the work of Harley Daniel in particular, and of Jim McComber and Carol Jablonski, the division chairs, respectively, for Central States and Southern. But I think, though we didn't get all of those things, we still have an excellent program. I'm pleased you're here, and I will turn this over to Sherry Daly from Indiana State.
When she was on the Indiana State University campus in 1989, made the observation, the most important thing is to call oneself that which is one's own name. For those of us who have read Alex Haley's Roots or seen the television series, we know that one of the most powerful and one of the most painful moments is the moment when Kunta Kinte fights to retain his name against odds that are overwhelming. He has a choice of either calling himself Toby or dying. And in the moment when he whispers barely audibly, rather than die, when he whispers the name Toby, we all feel his defeat. It is the case that if you want to destroy a person, you take away their lives. If you want to degrade them, you take away their chance to learn. But if you want to dehumanize them, you take away their names. Dred Scott was born in 1800. He was born in Virginia, and his name was Sam. Try as I may, I do not know where he got the name Dred Scott. But I do know that when I was a little girl and I first heard that name, I thought it was extraordinary. So apparently it is John Hope Franklin, because in the index of his book From Slavery to Freedom, all other people are listed by their last names. Dred Scott is listed by his first name. I said that he was born in 1800 and was called Sam. The next thing we know about him is that he was brought in 1830 by Peter Blow to St. Louis. St. Louis had been made a slave state, as you know, by the Missouri Compromise. But that move was extremely significant because in 1824, Missouri had passed the Freedom Law, which held that a slave could claim freedom if he or she had once lived in a free state. And indeed, in 1833, Dred Scott was sold by his original master to a doctor who was a surgeon in the U.S. Army. His name was John Emerson. Emerson took him first to Illinois and then to the Minnesota Territory, to Fort Snelling. In 1836, while in Minnesota, Dred Scott met Harriet, the slave, who was a slave of another man, who agreed to either sell or give her away, we don't know for sure, as a consequence of the fact that she and Dred wished to be married. And so Dred and Harriet Scott were married. Emerson hired them out while he went to fight various battles in the South. But of course, when he hired them out, he got all of the money that they earned. They then were brought back to Missouri. In 1843, Emerson died. He left in his will Dred and Harriet Scott to his widow, Irene Sanford Emerson. In 1846, Dred and Harriet filed separately for petitions to get their freedom in the St. Louis courthouse, which, even though we aren't having this program there, is just within sight, diagonally across from this hotel. In 1846, they filed. In 1847, they lost on a technicality. That was also the year, 1847, that Missouri passed a law which prohibited teaching blacks to read or to write. In 1850, they won their freedom. In March 22nd, 1852, Irene Sanford Emerson married, and in one of the many ironies of this case, she married a Massachusetts abolitionist. She turned her financial affairs, that is her property, over to her brother John Sanford. John Sanford appealed the case to the circuit court, which defended slavery, stating that it places, listen to this, that unhappy race within the pale of civilization. Of course, without slavery, they would have been outside of the pale. That was in 1852. In 1854, the Scotts filed again, a new case based on new premises, and this time the court upheld their right to sue. But the opposition decided to appeal the Scotts case to the U.S. Supreme Court. That's a very brief history of what happened. You're going to hear a great deal more about that today, including some more depth about this from David Zarefsky, who has not one but two papers that he would like to present today. And indeed, as complex as this case is, I'm sure that many of us are of two minds. David just happens to be illustrating it somewhat differently. So I will introduce each person before he speaks.
Thank you very much, Sherry. I actually have a schizophrenic paper. Sherry and Jim Darcy were generous enough to allow me to divide the two parts. First, just a bit on the case itself. As Sherry has indicated, the key facts are that while Dred was owned by Dr. Emerson, he was taken first to Illinois in 1835, I believe, for a period of about 2 years. Then in 1838 was taken to Fort Snelling in what was then Wisconsin Territory, what became Minnesota Territory. Illinois being a free state, and the territory being free under the terms of the Missouri Compromise, was then brought back to Missouri. The case before the Supreme Court, which was finally decided in 1857, contrary to what your printed convention program indicates, also contrary to that program, Missouri was a slave state. The case decided in 1857 was a complex decision that in many ways exceeded the facts of the case. There were, if I can generalize, there were really three separate aspects to the decision. The first was the question, was Dred Scott a citizen, either of Missouri or of the United States, since those were not at the time synonymous, and therefore entitled bring suit? The court held no. It could have held no on the grounds of the laws of Missouri, but it chose to hold no on a reading of the original intent of the founders of the Constitution, claiming that no descendant of an American slave could be a citizen. This was a proposition that was denied by the facts in some states of the Union. So the court reasoned that at the time the Constitution was adopted, this was the common understanding. Now, those who are amateur lawyers will realize that if that's the decision of the court, that should end the matter. If there's no standing to sue, then the rest of the case becomes moot. But the court proceeded to examine two other questions. One of those was, did Dred Scott become free by virtue of his residence in the free state of Illinois? The answer to that question could also decide the case by itself. The court concluded no, and concluded that the reason for principle of interstate comity, as one state respecting the law of another state, that once he returned to Missouri, Missouri law governed. And thus his residence in the free state of Illinois did not make him free. Scott and his wife had sued on grounds of false imprisonment and assault. And so either of these two premises, either of these two parts of the decision by itself would have been sufficient to decide the case. The court, however, had been urged by President-elect James Buchanan to put a stop to the divisive slavery agitation that was spreading all over the country by a definitive ruling in the case. Buchanan appealed especially to Justice Wayne, who convinced enough of his fellow justices that the court could render a real service by making a decisive decision that would stop, so they thought, the slavery agitation that had been gotten up, especially in the previous 3 years following the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And so they reached to the facts that related to Dred Scott's residence in Minnesota Territory and concluded that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. Now this, in a way, is a decision without any weight because the Missouri Compromise had been repealed 3 years before when the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed. Nonetheless, this was a decisive ruling of the court that it was never constitutional to begin with. Chief Justice Taney developed several arguments why that was so. Said, first of all, that the power of Congress over the territories referred only to those territories that were in place at the time the Constitution was ratified, that it did not include new territories. That being a somewhat weak argument, he then argued that Congress's power over the territories did not overturn the constitutional protection of property rights, and more generally that the congressional power over territories could not collide with other constitutional constraints and limitations. This, by the way, was the first case in which the Supreme Court used the concept of substantive due process. Due process was not just a procedural, but a content issue. Now, international law at the time held that a master who voluntarily took a slave to a free territory relinquishes the property rights in slaves, but the court concluded that that did not apply because of the protection of property in the Constitution. So this was a case in which the Supreme Court was moved to act in the way that it ultimately did for palpably political reasons. As Professor Cass Sunstein at the University of Chicago Law School has reminded us, there are several things about this decision that are particularly noteworthy. It's the first case since Marbury versus Madison in which the Supreme Court invalidated a federal law. And since in the Marbury case, the Supreme Court acted to deny a power that the Congress had given to itself, arguably this is the first real substantial exercise of judicial review. It is the first effort by the court to take a matter of political morality out of the realm of politics through the means of a judicial decision. It is the birthplace of the concept of substantive due process, and it is one of the very first cases unambiguously arguing the intent of the framers as the grounds for its decision. To say the least, it did not take slavery agitation out of the realm of politics. More later.
I'd like to read you one statement from that very complex, in fact, 54-page decision that David just referred to. The right of property in a slave is distinctly and expressly affirmed in the Constitution. The right of traffic in it, like an ordinary article of merchandise and property, was guaranteed to the citizens of the United States, and the government is pledged to protect it in all future time. All future time, of course, is of somewhat slight duration. The next speech was to be given by Andy King, who unfortunately is not able to be here today, but fortunately Jim Darcy is. And so he will be reading Andy's speech, which is entitled, Roswell Field as practicing rhetorician, the development of his skills as Dred Scott's lawyer.
I did forget to announce that having reneged on the courthouse, the oral interpretation, the dance line, that Andy King was not here. But that was not the problem of the planners, actually. So, Chief Justice Roger B. Tawney, in a quivering, barely audible voice, read excerpts from the 54 pages of paper on his desk. It was Friday, March 6, 1857, Decision Day in the case of Dred Scott v. John Hanning. After many years of futile litigation, a Missouri slave who could not have said with certainty who his true owner was supposed to be, had taken his struggle for freedom and that of his wife and daughters to the highest court in the land. According to the St. Louis Leader of the next day, reporters had had a difficult time grasping much of what Justice Tawney said during the course of his 2.5-hour oration. But this much was clear. Dred Scott was not entitled to his freedom because, as a slave of African descent, he was not considered to be a citizen of the United States, and as a non-citizen, he had no right to sue in American courts. The judge elaborated on the broader meaning of the case, a case big with political, social, and moral significance. Congress had no authority whatsoever to declare slavery unlawful in the territories, and the Missouri Compromise was smashed utterly. According to Tawney, it had been unconstitutional for more than 3 decades. While most scholars have concentrated on the text of the decision and its consequences for bringing on the war between the states, only 2 biographies have been written about Scott's lawyer, Roswell Field. Despite these biographies, Field remains a mysterious figure. He got no money for the case. We are not fully certain why he took the case. As an ex-Vermonter, he abhorred slavery, yet his particular motives are a matter of speculation. This essay hopes to explore the deep context of Roswell Field's early education and training in order to discover something about his strengths and limitations for this case, perhaps with the single exception of Brown versus the Board of Education, the most divisive Supreme Court decision ever made. Roswell Field was descended from the great English astronomer Sir John Field, who was the first scholar to introduce the Copernican system in England in 1543. Sir John, in 1556, published the first astronomical tables made publicly available in England. His grandson, Zachariah, arrived in Boston along with his numerous family in 1629. He spent some time in what is now Connecticut before he settled in Hadley, Massachusetts in 1657. Field's father, Martin, was a loyalist general. Later, he was a large landholder and relatively prosperous lawyer. His mother, Esther Smith Kellogg of Amherst, Massachusetts, was descended from Puritan preachers. Martin was a gifted musician and natural scientist. Esther was a watercolorist who assembled a theological library. Both parents were walking blue laws who attended a small church that served Baptist, Universalist, and Congregationals. Field and his brother grew up in a house populous with books. He attended the academy at Newfane called Wyndham Hall. There's an article about it in Zadok Thompson's History of Vermont that is vastly amusing. The curriculum was said to consist of English studies and some mathematics and the basic elements of the Latin, Greek, and German languages. I visited Lenore Banks, retired professor of Brown University, who allowed me to look at her numerous collection of old New England Academy materials. There were no extant copybooks from Wyndham Hall, but its successor in the townships still used commonplace books and made students memorize brilliant expressions from Cicero's orations. But from what remains of teacher notebooks, it is increasingly apparent to me that striking phrases were considered valuable resources, and a large number of them were memorized. Both Roswell and his brother Charles were to attend college. Roswell was sent to study under Reverend Whitcomb of Townsend, Vermont. The town was 4 miles to the north, and the surviving correspondence suggests to me that Roswell probably spent weekdays boarding with the Reverend Whitcomb and returned to his parents' house on weekends. Young Roswell spent many half-days, usually mornings, translating Latin into English and English into Latin. The young Roswell also mastered the ability to construe and parse the chorus, some portions of Virgil and the Greek Testament. He was also made to translate Cicero's Procaeus and both Cato's and Caesar's speeches on the Catilinarian conspiracy. He read and memorized all of Cicero's select orations in English. The old Asa Gray edition contains only 8. Portions of the Iliad and Dalzell's Collecticanae Graecae Memorica filled out the rest of the 2-year grind. Roswell chopped wood for the manse every morning, milked the minister's cow, and repaired rock fences in the spring to help earn his board. A descendant, Anne Whitcomb of White Plains, New York, allowed me to look at what purported to be a green, it was black with age, ledger in which Reverend Whitcomb recorded his tutorials. I saw 2 entries for Field, but it was a Charles Field and not Roswell. In the fall of 1818, at the ripe age of 11, young Field finished his extended college prep with Reverend Whitcomb and was ready for college. His older brother Charles was already at Amherst. Charles transferred and the 2 youths went off to Middlebury College, where the stiffer element had prevailed. A Princetonian had brought scientific apparatus to the place, and it prided itself on its greater emphasis on science. There were no electives in Roswell Field's day, and the curriculum was still heavily weighted toward religion, classics, and languages. Joshua Bate, president of Middlebury, formally assured parents that he would not allow any conflict between science and religion at the institution. I have had considerable fun looking at his bulletin, in which he notes that science has sometimes caused skepticism about religion, but he would never, never, never allow such a thing to happen at his young school. Field learned to read Spanish, French, and German, perhaps Italian. The first 3 languages stood him in good stead as a lawyer in Pulpit, St. Louis. The old family romance unfolded. His mother wanted him to become a minister, but his father wanted him to be a lawyer. Despite 4 years' daily attendance at Middlebury Chapel, Field showed no religious awakening. Roswell went on to study law under his uncle, Daniel Kellogg. As far as my present research indicates, Roswell was a very bored young lawyer. The cases were trivial and mostly the result of a state appointment. Spavine horse cases were looked upon as important, and half the state, along with Roswell, migrated west between the years 1820 and 1835. Roswell was a gifted lawyer in St. Louis, despite his relative isolation from the moving forces of the new metropolis. He may have been the equal of any of the other 130 lawyers in the city of 30,000 inhabitants, but he was almost completely ignorant of the one category of law that made practice different in the South and border states, slave law. In all of the research I have done so far, I have no indication of Field's motives. He does not tell us why he agreed to take on an almost hopeless case. He does tell us that he sought advice from numerous persons on the case. Some historians saw him as part of an abolitionist conspiracy. There is no hard evidence for this view. I have read Melvin Gray on this subject. Gray says in so many words that Field was anti-slavery in sentiment like most Vermonters, but that he took on the case for judicial reasons. I have read materials that indicate that Field actually thought he could win this case, and that it would be a reputation-making, career-enhancing event. At any rate, the riddle continues, and this is a general description of my research in the area. I have been looking at correspondence between Field and his colleagues, correspondence that is rhetorical to the highest degree. It is aimed at assessing the power of various arguments, and initially at the probability of winning the case in Washington. This is a report from the barricades. Andrew King, Louisiana State University.
There are first being what Andy via Jim suggested with regard to the lawyer field. The second is, what was a slave to do to earn his living during the many years that this case was being tried? And the answer to that question is a very complex one. We know that Field was working for nothing, but we also know that Dred Scott was being held in abeyance. He was working, of course, for not very much money, but the money he did earn was put in an escrow account and being held back until a final decision would be rendered. Some people believe that the reason why, after the 1954 victory that Field received in Missouri, some reason why John Sanford went on and pressed the case to the U.S. Supreme Court was purely financial and not moral. Other people think that that's a cynical reading of the situation. Our next speaker is Jim Andrews, and he is going to be speaking on the topic, the Dred Scott Decision and the Formation of Images in the South. He's asked me to read a quotation from the Supreme Court of Missouri, March 22nd, 1852. Justice William Scott read the opinion of the court. Times are not as they were when the former decisions on this subject were made. Keep in mind, this is 1952, and so this was when a verdict was rendered against Dred Scott and his wife Harriet. This is the case that quotation I read earlier about the unhappy race with the pale of civilization only coming as a consequence of their slavery. This was when that verdict was rendered. Since then, not only individuals but states have been possessed with a dark and fell spirit in relation to slavery, whose gratification is sought in the pursuit of measures whose inevitable consequences must be the overthrow and destruction of our government. Under such circumstance, it does not behoove the state of Missouri to show the least countenance to any measure which might gratify this spirit. She is willing to assume her full responsibility for the existence of slavery within her limits, nor does she seek to share or divide it with others. Although that we may, for our own sake, regret that the avarice and hard-heartedness of the progenitors of those who are now so sensitive on the subject ever introduced the institution among us, yet we will not go to them to learn law, morality, or religion on the subject. Jeanette.
I do have to say that the description of Field's education, I don't know, it didn't sound so odd to me. I think at Penn State we always had to milk the cows in the morning first thing, part of our, I think they probably still do. Penn State As Justice Scott said, times in the 1850s were not the same as they had been in the 1820s. One of the amazing things about the case when it came to Missouri, of course, was that the precedents were in favor of Dred Scott. But the political climate was so different. The sectional conflicts of the antebellum period had intensified feelings, particularly with regard to how each section viewed the other. From 1820 to 1860, the bonds of affection were increasingly being strained until they finally of course, broke. Justice Scott, in rendering Missouri's opinion, reflected this growing hostility in that rather bitter synecdoche in which all the New England slave traders who first started the darn thing were the progenitors of now these New England abolitionists. My paper actually deals with Dred Scott and images of a formation of images of the South, not necessarily in the South, sorry, because I'm going to talk about. I was thinking of this as a Central States convention, and now when I think about all the awful things I'm going to say, about the South. I didn't say them, remember that. But the antipathy just grew and grew during these years, from verbal jousts to actual lethal encounters in which people were induced to kill each other. And they were induced to kill people who were thought of in the past as the heirs to the same revolution, as their brethren, as their fellow Americans. Now, they were going to kill them. In Warriors, the Reflections on Men in Battle, Glenn Gray observed that the basic aim of a nation at war is in establishing an image of the enemy is to distinguish as sharply as possible the act of killing from the act of murder by making the former into one deserving all honor and praise. How did Americans come to decide that it was honorable to fight and to kill other Americans? In Richard Holmes' book, Acts of War, he says, the soldier goes to war with an abstract image of the enemy in his mind's eye, an image sometimes sullied by officially inspired propaganda, and almost always spattered by the mud thrown by the popular press. The very language he's encouraged to use will suggest that he's dealing not with another human being thrust by the turn of the dice into a different uniform, but with a mere object of hostility, belonging to some different tribe, almost to another species. One of the things that I think is a very interesting question for rhetorical scholars is, how did we get from this period of the early national period where we were becoming Americans to the point where we are different tribes, almost different species? Scholars have written a lot about the reasons for the war. Not only the causes for the war, but the reasons why people fought. James McPherson, for example, has done a couple of very excellent books. And others have studied what they thought were the motivations of people who fought. And there were a lot of ideological kinds of motivations. So McPherson has read thousands and thousands of letters, for example, and argued. So that people did believe that they were doing things like fighting to preserve the Union, or they were fighting for liberty, which was both sides, or independence on the South, or they were because of revulsions to slavery and so forth. So there were these ideological reasons. And what I'd like to argue is that while there were such things, what it really took years of rhetorical effort, and I think in this newspapers played a significant part. I'm talking today just about newspapers primarily, in painting portraits vivid and threatening enough to objectify the enemy. While perhaps that's not sufficient to ignite the conflict, certainly hostility toward a personified enemy makes war possible. Holt alludes to this situation as he observes in passing that the basic Northern sentiment may have been anti-Southernism, opposition to white slaveholders, and not necessarily sympathy for black slaves. And I think if one looks at the rhetoric of this period, aside from the abolitionists, a lot of the hostility is not necessarily toward slavery as toward those people who held slaves. Today I'm going to illustrate my case just by briefly inquiring into the reactions to the Dred Scott decision and then examining a small sample of the evidence of the ways in which the characterization of the South in Northern editorials completed a kind of synecdotal process whereby the slave-holding aristocracy became the personification for the South. There is a popular conception, not among scholars, but among many people. For instance, our students are always stunned when you talk about, you say everybody in the South didn't have a slave. That the South was not this homogeneous entity. And even at the time, when these Yankee soldiers started to move into the South, some of them were stunned. For example, Captain James Sly of Grand Rapids, Michigan, wrote home in his astonishment at finding they are certainly the most primitively ignorant people I ever came across. And Never supposed Kentucky was so far behind popular civilization. If you're from Indiana, you still hold it. The occasion of these sectional controversies usually presented a paradox. As Fehrenbacher observed, by 1860, the principal sectional issues, such as the tariff, national banking, internal improvements, slavery in the territories, had all been resolved in favor of the South as far as official national policies were concerned. David Potter was going to argue the same thing. And as David Dred was saying earlier, the court hoped now, with the decision, they were going to solve all this. This was going to end the controversy. Well, the problem was, of course, that these victories turned into inflammatory kinds of occasions. The Dred Scott decision was a perfect case in point. The Charleston Mercury itself observed the decision was a victory more fatal, perhaps, than defeat, because it so inflamed Northern opinion. Jefferson Davis, looking back on the rise and fall of the Confederacy some years later, was still indignant that instead of accepting the decision of this then august tribunal, the ultimate authority in the interpretation of constitutional questions, as conclusive of a controversy that had so long disturbed the peace and was threatening the perpetuity of the Union, it was flouted, denounced, and utterly disregarded by the Northern agitators, and served only to stimulate the intensity of their sectional hostility. So that the decision itself, aside from all the legal ramifications, aside from the political, had the effect of inflaming the North, of throwing gasoline on the fire. The Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania Gazette, for example, is a good indication, and if one just looks at the intensity of the metaphor, you get an idea of the kind of reaction. We believe that this decision lately thrust upon us will have its just and proper effect. It will awaken the friends of freedom to renewed efforts. If there is left one spark of manliness among the freemen of Pennsylvania and of the free North, they will address themselves anew to the battle, gird on their armor for the victory that must sooner or later crown their efforts. He goes on to talk about we're going to fight a war, really to elect Republicans, was the point of it. The Albany Evening Journal, in describing the outcome of the case, illustrates clearly not only the militancy of the North in the face of this kind of judicial decision, but it exemplifies the ways in which the South was embodied in the persona of the slaveholder. 347,527 slaveholders in the Republic accomplished the day before yesterday a great success, as shallow men estimate success. They converted the Supreme Court of Law and Equity of the United States of America into a propagandist of human slavery. Seeing the decision as evidence of the theory that there was a conspiracy to make the nation all slave, the Evening Journal's editorial writer had no doubt that it was a conspiracy of the oligarchy, and sought to rally all who love Republican institutions and who hate aristocracy. Compact yourselves together for the struggle which threatens your liberty and will test your manhood. There's an interesting irony in that both the North and the South fixed on this similar conception, and yet interpreted it so different to personify the South. And that is, the Southern aristocracy meant to the North lords of the lash. And as a lieutenant in the 2nd Minnesota wrote home in February 1683, slavery and aristocracy go hand in hand. And aristocracy brought on this war. That aristocracy must be broken up. It is rotten and corrupt. This planter aristocracy was what stood for the whole South. On the other hand, how did the South talk about it? It talked about the chivalry. And it represented the embodiment of the cavalier. Henry Ewing, who was a young volunteer who left the University of Virginia to join the Confederate Army, said the scum of the North cannot face the chivalric spirit of the South. Horace Greeley was another who said, this war is a war in the spirit of privilege, caste, that has instigated all these crimes. The Northern rhetoric, the antebellum period, particularly the 1850s, and increasingly after Dred Scott, defined what the aristocracies were like. And in this, the newspapers played a major part. There's several. I've got some other stuff I'm going to cut through here to the getting to. There is a chase, which I headed for. Everybody, thoughtful people on both sides said, the newspapers just picture us wrong. The newspapers just pick the worst things to say about us. They were saying that in the South about the Northern press, and in the North about the Southern press. But the editorial rockets really took flight after Dred Scott's decision. Both sides were engaged in this verbal bombardment. The London Times, very conservative as it was, as much as it hated the British radicals who kept saying, look at America as this wonderful place where democracy is really working, was probably delighted to write, no sneering exponent of old world ideas has ever written or said one tide of the evil against the citizens of the Republic, which they are now uttering against themselves. The depiction of the South and Northern newspapers detailed the meaning of aristocracy that stood proxy for the entire region. Its pretensions to chivalry, from the point of view of the Northern editorials, was a mask for despotism, barbarism, and oppression. A major rhetorical effort was underway to obliterate these kind of fraternal feelings and create separate identities by identifying who the Southerners were. I've got 4 minutes.
3.
Oh, well, it's an awful thing. Let me give you a couple examples here quickly. Who are the men who lauded it so long and so despotically over the free men of the North? They are the men who dreamed of freedom in a slave's embrace and waking sold their offspring to and their own to slavery. They're the men who prated of freedom for the sake of establishing and perpetuating slavery, who boasted of liberty they might exercise despotism, who vaunted their own prowess and chivalry, that they might conceal their own innate cowardice and meanness. There's several editorials that say, is it America or is it Austria in the South because of the way they treated abolitionists? They also talked about the vaunted slavery, the vaunted bravery of the South, and their cowardice, what braggarts they were. Northern papers loved to say awful things about the South. South Carolina was Tory during the Revolution. She had no revolutionary father. She is a bastard state, politically speaking. This is my favorite. I don't know. This is what gave me pause. And I thought, yeah, why did I make North Carolina a venture here? As for North Carolina, it is known that she is the most ignorant and degraded of all the states. They eat mud in North Carolina. They have a kind of blue clay that the denizens devour. The people are like oysters without brains, with bellies full of mud. Well, now, and of course I know there are some Texans here. And the Detroit Daily Advertiser waxed eloquent about Texas progenitors. Every horse thief, murderer, gambler, robber, and other rogue of high and low degree fled to Texas when he found that the United States was too hot to hold it. The pioneers of that state were cutthroats of one kind or another, with some honorable exceptions. Those of them who have escaped hanging or the state prison, and their descendants are the men who led the secession movement in that state. There is one particular editorial, and I'll just end with this by quickly, that I think gives, it sort of epitomizes the whole feeling, because it argues there have always been 2 Americas. There have always been the Puritans and Jamestown. There have always been the hard workers, the strong religious values, the problem, the gamblers, those who came here not for freedom, but to recoup their lost estates. And this goes into great detail about, this is what the Southern chivalry means. And we're not the same, haven't been the same. We've always been two different people. And it ends up, as their absurd of the Puritans. They despise the sons of Yankees. There is no bond of sympathy between us now. The principles of the one are not those of the other. So in the few years following the Dred Scott decision, I have to say in quick conclusion, I was just reading about Charles Sumner, who went on a lecture tour. He gave this lecture at the University of Michigan, and he spoke for 2.5 hours. And he was so affronted because he said, in conclusion, and the students rose and cheered. He left town without even getting his fee. But in conclusion, in the few years following the Dred Scott decision, the war of words between North and South escalated dramatically in the editorials of both North and South. And I've only talked about the Northern papers, but certainly the Southern papers were equally as harsh in their evaluation of the Yankee character. Increasingly, the message that we were not friends but enemies overwhelmed any hope that Lincoln's admonition that the reverse should be true would be heeded. Lieutenant Preeminent Ferry, a Michigan Democrat, observed that a generation has been educated to hate the South, and most earnestly is the hate returned. In this, I think popular rhetoric was instrumental, and as such made a fratricidal war possible.
And now David Zarefsky, the sequel. You'll be speaking on the topic, Dred Scott and the rhetorical position of the political parties.
As an almost native Texan, I grew up believing that Indiana was the most degraded state. At the time of the Dred Scott decision, the most heated political issue focused on Kansas territory. Kansas, which under the Kansas-Nebraska Act had been carved out of Nebraska territory. The question was whether Kansas, which was now legally open to slavery, would become slave or free. The Democrats had won the 1856 presidential election on the platform of popular sovereignty, a platform that had been developed in 1848 by Lewis Cass and then renewed by Stephen A. Douglas. Popular sovereignty held that those who went to the territory should decide that question. Of course, the reference was only to the white people who went to the territory who should decide that question. But it never said when they would decide that question. And this was an important issue because if the decision was held off until the territory sought admission as a state, and slaveholders could go there with their slaves, supporters of freedom would be less likely to go, and the more likely it would be that the territory would become a slave state. The earlier decision was made before slaveholders got there, the likelier it would be that the territory would remain free. The platform was silent. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was silent. Stephen A. Douglas, the most prominent Democrat in the country, with the possible exception of James Buchanan, the president, had said that the Supreme Court would soon decide this simple question of when the territory could answer. No one disputed that a state possessed the right to decide for itself whether it would be slave or free. But territories, unlike states, were creatures of the federal government and thus presumably subject to strictures imposed upon it. With this brief background, let me say that the Dred Scott came as a rhetorical exigence like a thunderbolt into this political discussion. It posed massive rhetorical problems for both the Democrats and for the infant Republican Party that had emerged only the year before with the presidential candidacy of John C. Fremont after the Whigs had dissolved on their failure to reconcile their northern and southern wings. On the face of it, the Dred Scott decision holding that Congress lacked the power to prohibit slavery in the territories invalidated popular sovereignty because the territorial legislature was the creature of Congress. What Congress could not do, so the argument ran, it could not delegate to others to do. And So Dred Scott seemingly undercut the Democratic Party platform as championed particularly by Stephen Douglas. Certainly Lincoln was quick to make this charge. He said that under Dred Scott, squatter sovereignty, as he called it, squatted out of existence. And that Douglas was left to defending the proposition that if A chooses to enslave B, C has no right to object. Douglas, faced with this exigence, invented the following rhetorical position. One, he said, the Dred Scott decision in no way invalidates popular sovereignty because it refers only to an act of Congress, not to the territorial legislature. He rejected the belief that the territorial legislature was fundamentally a creature of the Congress, and he argued instead that the territory was a state in the womb, an incipient state, if you will, and was entitled to exercise the same prerogatives that a state would exercise. And his defense was the following rhetorical question. Those of you in Iowa or Missouri, he would say, no one denies that you have the competence and the judgment to decide this question for yourselves. Why should you lose your judgment to decide it because you travel from Missouri into Kansas? This position would be criticized as sophistic, and Lincoln and others would claim all that's required is another decision that would extend the principle of Dred Scott to the territorial legislature. So Douglas developed a second position as well. He dissociated, in Perlman's terms, the concept of rights. He said there are rights and then there are rights. The Dred Scott decision says you have the right to take your slave to a territory, but that would be a barren and worthless right if the territory did not pass laws to protect you in your property right once you got there. And he used the analogy to liquor. He said you may have a property right to take your liquor into the territory, but if the territory passes a Maine law, a prohibition law, your abstract right to take your liquor there won't do you any good. So first he said the territory could keep slavery out by passing unfriendly legislation. He later said the territory could keep it out by refusing to pass friendly legislation. Now this position, at the time it was put forward, a few months after the Dred Scott decision, won Douglas wide support in both the North and the South. But his support from the South would soon erode, because the Southern support for Douglas assumed that from this line of reasoning that I've just presented, he would reach the conclusion, therefore, the territory is obligated to pass friendly local legislation, a position that Douglas refused to take, claiming that he did not want to interfere in any way in the actions of the territory. And so by the time, several months after the Dred Scott decision, that Kansas territory submitted a constitution to come into the Union as a slave state, Douglas opposed it, and from that point, his standing in the South quickly eroded, and the Southern Democrats took the view that the implication of Dred Scott, a decision that they had not lobbied for or campaigned for, that the implication of Dred Scott is Congress and the territories have a positive obligation to protect slavery in the territory. The decision created at least as great a problem for the new Republican Party, which had only one principal plank, and that was opposition to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Douglas believed that Congress had the power to keep slavery out of the territories, but shouldn't exercise it. Lincoln and the Republicans believed that Congress had the power to keep slavery out and should exercise that power, and the Dred Scott decision undercut the one plank of the platform. Republicans groped around for how to deal with this exigence and developed a whole series of different lines of argument. One was to suggest there was a practical remedy. Win the 1860 election, have a Republican president who would appoint Republican justices to the Supreme Court, and in time the Dred Scott decision would be overturned. I find this a particularly interesting rhetorical position because it right from the start treats the Supreme Court decision as a political act, and it suggests that Ronald Reagan was hardly the first president who thought about composing the Supreme Court on ideological grounds. Second response they made was to deny the claim that the Supreme Court was the final arbiter of constitutional questions. This was, after all, the first act of Congress that had been overturned since Marbury versus Madison. Lincoln and others denied that the Supreme Court had the final say, and claimed that if they were presented with the question of whether slavery should be extended, would vote against it, notwithstanding the Supreme Court decision. A third position that they took was a legally grounded position, and it goes back to my earlier remarks. They said that any decision of any court contains two parts: the rule, that is, with apologies to Al Gore, the controlling legal authority, and dictum, opinion, that the court might express. Since courts decide cases on the narrowest possible grounds, exercising casuistic reasoning, the rule in the case is Dred Scott loses because he is not a citizen and has no standing to sue, and all of the discussion of the Missouri Compromise is dictum. Or as Salmon Chase would say at one point, it is entitled to exactly as much weight as one would give to the opinions of any 9 gentlemen assembled in a Washington bar room. Now, this was an attempt to position the Republicans as supporting Dred Scott in the narrowest sense. That is, they denied that Dred Scott was entitled to his freedom, because that position would have created major problems for them, since they were not an abolitionist party, did not believe in black citizenship, black voting, etc., but would not require them to support the position that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. And then their final position, following a line of argument that Jim Andrews alluded to, was to suggest that the Dred Scott decision was part of a plot, a conspiracy to spread slavery all over the country, and that what it took to do that was to get public opinion to say, well, Dred Scott is the law of the land, we must go along with it. And as soon as they did that, as soon as public opinion was dulled, there would be another decision, which I refer to for ease of explanation as the imaginary Dred Scott II, which would hold that just as Dred Scott said no territory could outlaw slavery, Dred Scott II would say no state could outlaw slavery. There was no evidence of any such conspiracy of which I'm aware, and yet the idea was very much in the wind at the time, and there was at least a case making its way through the courts, the case of Lemon versus the People, that was developing the argument that the right of a slaveholder to travel with his property needed to be protected as part of the First Amendment of the Constitution. This is ironic because the court in later years would find the right to travel in the First Amendment that would mean the ideological opposite of what the Lemon case was urging the court to declare. So the main reason that the Dred Scott decision did not, as Buchanan predicted, put an end to slavery agitation is that it posed a rhetorical exigence of gigantic proportion in the midst of a very heated political controversy about what to do with respect to slavery in Kansas Territory following the Kansas-Nebraska Battle.
The Dred Scott decision, as you already heard, was rendered on March 6, 1857. 16 months later, September 17, 1858, Dred Scott died of tuberculosis. He died while Lincoln and Douglas, in the congressional district just across the river, were engaged in one of their now famous debates. And to talk to us about the aftermath of the Dred Scott decision, my notes are over here, is Cully Clark, who will be speaking on Reconstructing America in the aftermath of Dred Scott.
I am now left to the obiter dicta, and David worth any average one man. I will, in a moment, explain why I have been selected for this panel. I will, in upholding the Southern tradition, resent Jim Andrews' eloquence and David Zarefsky's clarity. In case you didn't notice, David was working from only the barest notes, and everything came out in complete paragraphs. That is to be resented. Before I go further, and I will act in the manner of a respondent here, I am awfully impressed with the question, did Dred Scott become free by virtue of his residence? In fact, all that we have been talking about, including Jim's paper, Andy's report, David's, has to do with borders and lines. Let me advise you of a project that's underway and that is rather fascinating. Some of you may know the work of Eddie Ayers at the University of Virginia. His most recent book that got wide circulation was on the New South, but he started a project at the University of Virginia that's looking at two counties. One in Virginia is Augusta County, in which Stanton and Lexington are located. The other is right across the line in Pennsylvania, and it is either Washington or Franklin, one of those big names. This project is online. You may visit the site. I don't have the .com for you, but you may visit it, iWeb. They are looking at the question of why people of such clear affinity, demographically speaking, in terms of the political economy, the same, identical kind of populations, why they would engage in such a fratricidal war for a period of some 4 years. And it's a most interesting question where evidence is being made available to the public is being invited to contribute evidence, thoughts, suggestions to this discussion as they develop, as it were, a kind of public text on a question such as the one you addressed, Jim, which is the rhetorical construction of the other. And here we're talking about a line as thin as that between Kosovo and Serbia. So a very interesting project, and one that would bear following. When I began preparation for this, after James Darcy had asked me to become involved in this, I first went to John Updike and pulled off James Buchanan in the Ford administration and reread it. I decided, though, after getting back into the book and remembering Updike's penchant for the prurient, that it would be either bodacious or audacious for me to get back into the topic in that fashion. And so what I am going to do today is to simply tell you why I'm here. I am representing the truest of the Southern tradition. I was selected to this panel by virtue of where I grew up. I grew up in the center of the universe. I did not need Santa Claus or God to confirm that fact. I learned it very early on, a very small town in southwest Georgia. As you know, if you've grown up in a small town, you're always the biggest and best at something. We were the world's largest colored seed market. A fact that instilled in me great pride of location that lasted even after 10 years later I discovered it in 2 sheds out on Highway 84. And if I needed further confirmation, I could, with Kathy Turner, visit the cartoons, only in this case it was Bugs Bunny. Or on an afternoon in 1950, I went to the picture show and saw Bugs Bunny in the role of Christopher Columbus demonstrating that the earth was round. The little town I grew up in, by the way, was named Cairo, as in Cairo, Illinois, and the uninitiated would pronounce that Cairo. Well, Bugs Bunny, in order to demonstrate that the earth was indeed round, hurled a baseball that went around the earth, and it came back with all the ancient capitals stickered on the ball. And right in the middle was confirmation that I live in the center of the universe. Now, when you're bragging about being from a small town, you always then run off the names. Who is from a small town, and I'm fixing to trump everybody in the room. Given the fact that Bush Stadium and Martin Dwyer are nearby here, Jackie Robinson was born in my hometown. There's a point in all this, if you fear that I digress too far. In fact, Jackie Robinson was born on my Uncle Lloyd and Edna's farm, about 6 miles south of town. When I get home, which is often, I walk out there. It's a beautiful walk along some beautiful country roads. Now, what I do tell my students today is that if Jackie Robinson had grown up in that beautiful, wonderful little place in which I grew up, there would have been no Jackie Robinson. It was the courage of his mother that at age 1.5 or 2 allowed her to take him and his 4 older siblings to Pasadena, California. And it was there that he grew up, a place of residence that now begins to matter in his story. One of the dangers of scholarship on all of this subject is that we take the notion of racism, which is uniform, and we apply it the way Southerners would in the 2 quote we argue, that the rest of the country is just as bad. And yet Jackie Robinson made it because he moved away. Now, if you read his autobiographies, and if you read Arnold Rampersad's recent biography of Jackie Robinson, you will see a man that talks about racism in the same terms and the same language that I would have experienced racism in the part of the world where I grew up. So racism is common. What was different was the kind of world, the legal principle of equality in his place of residence. And the fact is, there would have been no Jackie Robinson had he grown up in Cairo, Georgia. It was his removal to Pasadena that made all the difference in the world. That fact brings me to the following comment of Lincoln. I think any panel engaged in this discussion eventually should move to Lincoln. I lifted it from Gary Will's book on the remaking of America, and let me read to you from Lincoln. Our national ideal outtravels our experience, and all experience. We began our national career by setting all history at defiance. For that said, history said, a republic on a large scale cannot exist. Our progress since has shown that we were right in refusing to be limited by the past. The political ideas of the nation are transcendent, not empirical. Human history could not justify the Declaration of Independence and its large statements of the new idea. The nation went behind human history and appealed to human nature. My only quarrel with Lincoln is that you would find the notion of equality in human nature. He is correct in the argument and the notion that it is to be found in political discourse and in the constitution of government. As we look at these papers and this topic, we should be mindful of a very simple fact, that there have been only 3 lifetimes to give us our present state of affairs. There was the 70 years that led from our Constitution to the Civil War, in which we tested the notion of whether equality as a concept of citizenship was in fact embedded in that Constitution. And discovering that it was not in Dred Scott, then we went to war. We then went another 70 years in which we made the constitutional commitment to equality in the 14th and 15th Amendments and citizenship, and then we gradually proscribed it over that period of time. And then from 1930 to the present, the last lifetime, another 70 years, begun to reclaim, reconstitute, reconstruct a society along lines that were first conceived because Dred Scott revealed for all to see the bankruptcy of our original document. So historians are mindful that what happened as a result of Dred Scott was quite literally a remaking of the political context and the Constitution in which equality could be debated and adjudicated. I will close simply by saying that Henry Adams once said of Rooney Lee, the son of Robert E. Lee. Henry Adams had met him at Harvard, that you could learn only 4 things from Southerners. That was bad manners, whiskey, poker, and treason.
We don't know much about Dred Scott. Most of the comments that you've heard have been written by folks who were not under any strictures against teaching them to read and write. So we don't know much about him. We don't even know if he was in the courtroom at the times that his case was being considered. What we do know is that 1 month after that 1857 decision, there was an interview with Dred and Harriet Scott, as well as their 2 daughters, and we know he was pretty smart. I would like to remind you of the title of this program, Dred Scott, The Rhetorical Legacy. Because in that interview, Dred Scott said that it was unfortunate he didn't get his freedom because he could have made thousands of dollars on the lecture circuit. So I think maybe he was also a modern man. However, we do know what Frederick Douglass said on this topic. The Supreme Court is not the only power in this world. We, the abolitionists and colored people, should meet this decision unlooked for and monstrous as it appears, in a cheerful spirit. This very attempt to blot out forever the hopes of an enslaved people may be one necessary link in the chain of events preparatory to the complete overthrow of the whole slave system. Thank my colleagues. Thanks to Jim and Frederick Douglass.
Well, first it was the courthouse, and then the interpretation, and then the 2-hour time slot, and then Andy came. And my final regret is that we have cheated you out of your time for questioning. The time for the panel is over. But I hope that you feel, as I do, enriched by the presentation here today. I'm certain that the panelists would be happy to entertain further discussion in the hallways and over breakfast and coffee and whatever. I want to thank the 4 distinguished panelists. I want to thank Sherry Daly for working with me on this. And I want to thank all of you for attending.